The hook. Miguel's lips still tingled with the phantom warmth of her touch as he stood alone among the dying tomato plants, the words he'd just spoken hanging in the desert air like smoke. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the strange new sensation of sound vibrating through his throat, a feeling he'd never experienced in his 12 years of perfect silence. The garden stretched before him in various stages of defeat. Grandmother Rosa's once proud roses had withered to brown skeletal fingers, their petals scattered across the cracked earth like confetti from a funeral. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, promising another day where even the lizards would seek shade by noon. Yet where the woman in white had knelt just moments ago, a single white rose bloomed impossibly full and fragrant, its petals catching light as if lit from within. Miguel reached toward it, then stopped. His fingers moved unconsciously in the sign language his mother had taught him. Beautiful, impossible, scared, but the words felt inadequate now. He had spoken aloud, actually spoken. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow, and he sank to his knees in the dirt, pressing his palms against the warm earth where she had touched. "Mijo, you have been chosen for this burden." Her voice echoed in his memory, though he still couldn't understand how he'd heard her. It hadn't come through his ears, those had been useless since birth, but had somehow bloomed directly in his mind like water seeping into dry soil. "These words I give you will cut like knives, but they will also heal like medicine. You must be brave, little prophet." The back door of the adobe house creaked open, and Miguel looked up to see his mother, Elena, stepping onto the covered porch with a basket of wet laundry. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to run a household while working double shifts at the hospital laundry. At 34, she wore her worry lines like badges of service, one for each financial crisis weathered, each medical bill conquered, each night spent wondering if her silent son would ever find his place in a world that demanded voices. She hadn't noticed him yet, focused on shaking out his father's work shirts before the heat turned the wet fabric into steam. Miguel wanted to call out to her, to test if the miracle was real or if he'd imagined it all. But something held him back, perhaps the weight of the woman's warnings, or maybe just the fear that his voice had been only a beautiful dream. "Miguel Santos," the woman had said, and hearing his full name in that otherworldly voice had made him feel ancient and important and terrified all at once. "You will speak truths that others have buried. First, you will go to Mrs. Delgado on Elm Street and tell her that her husband Carlos did not die in an accident at the copper mine 23 years ago. Tell her the foreman, Mr. Whitfield, knows what really happened to the men who asked too many questions about the safety violations." The memory of those words made Miguel's stomach clench. He knew Mrs. Delgado from church, a tiny woman with silver hair who always saved peppermint candies in her purse and smelled like vanilla and sadness. She lived alone in a house full of photographs of a man with kind eyes and calloused hands. Miguel had never heard the details of how Mr. Delgado died, but he'd seen how his mother and the other church ladies lowered their voices when they spoke of it, crossing themselves quickly as if warding off bad luck. How could he possibly walk up to this grieving widow and shatter whatever peace she'd built around her husband's memory? How could he trust words that came from a woman who appeared and vanished like morning mist? But even as doubt crept in, Miguel felt the truth of it settling in his bones. The woman in white hadn't just given him a voice, she'd given him knowledge that burned behind his ribs like swallowed fire. He knew with certainty that bypassed logic that Carlos Delgado had died because he'd discovered something dangerous. He could almost see it, men in hard hats arguing in a mine shaft, voices echoing off stone walls, the terrible moment when speaking up became a death sentence. "Hijo," his mother's voice cut through his visions. She'd spotted him kneeling in the dirt and was hurrying over, her face creased with concern. "¿Qué pasa? Why are you out here so early?" Miguel opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain that a woman made of light had given him impossible messages to deliver? How could he tell his devout Catholic mother that he might be losing his mind, or worse, that he might be telling the truth? Instead, he pointed to the single perfect rose blooming amid the devastation. Elena followed his gaze and gasped, dropping her laundry basket. Wet clothes scattered across the porch as she crossed herself slowly, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Dios mío," she whispered. Rosa's miracle rose. Elena stared at the impossible bloom for a long moment before kneeling beside Miguel in the dirt, her hospital scrubs growing dusty as she reached toward the rose with trembling fingers. She stopped just short of touching it, as if the flower might burn her or disappear at her touch. "Your grandmother always said her roses would bloom again when heaven needed to send a message," she whispered, more to herself than to Miguel. "But I thought it was just cuentos de viejas, old women's stories." Miguel watched his mother's face cycle through wonder, fear, and something that looked almost like grief. He wanted to tell her about the woman in white, about the voice that had filled his mind like warm honey, about the terrible knowledge now weighing on his shoulders. But the words, his first real words, felt too precious and dangerous to waste on explanations no one would believe. Instead, he signed, "Grandmother's spirit?" Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe, mijo, maybe she's watching over us still." She pulled him close, and Miguel breathed in the familiar scent of industrial detergent and the vanilla perfume she saved for Sundays. This was his world, the weight of his mother's protective arms, the whispered Spanish prayers that had been his lullabies, the silent conversations conducted in gestures and glances. The sound of a truck door slamming announced his father's return from the early shift at the construction site. Roberto Santos appeared around the corner of the house, his work boots leaving dusty prints on the flagstone path their family had laid together last spring. At 42, he moved like a man older than his years, his broad shoulders curved inward from decades of physical labor and the particular exhaustion that came from working twice as hard to prove himself in crews where his accented English made some men assume he was less capable. Miguel felt the familiar tightness in his chest as his father approached. It wasn't that Roberto was unkind, quite the opposite. His love was fierce and protective and sometimes suffocating in its intensity. But Miguel had seen the way his father's face would go carefully blank when people asked about his son's condition, had watched him practice saying Miguel is deaf but very intelligent in the mirror until the words came out smooth and defensive. "¿Qué pasa aquí?" Roberto asked, taking in the scene. Elena kneeling in the dirt, Miguel beside her, the scattered laundry, and finally the miraculous rose that made him stop mid-step. "Look, Roberto," Elena whispered, pointing. "Rosa's rose. It's blooming." Miguel's father stared at the flower with the same expression he wore when studying blueprints for particularly complex jobs, analytical, searching for the logical explanation that would make everything make sense. Roberto Santos was a man who believed in hard work, family, and the kind of faith that expressed itself through action rather than mysticism. Miracles were for saints and storybooks, not for Tuesday mornings in dying gardens. But even he couldn't deny what they were seeing. "Maybe the sprinkler system is leaking underground," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "Giving it extra water." Elena shot him a look that could have withered the cactus. "Roberto, or maybe it's a sign," he amended quickly, crossing himself. "Your mother always said—" The sharp whistle of the morning freight train interrupted him, carrying the sound across the desert from the tracks that divided their neighborhood from the Anglo part of town. Miguel felt the vibration through the ground beneath his knees, one of the few ways he experienced the wider world's rhythm. He'd learned to read Tucson's heartbeat through his body, the rumble of morning traffic through the floorboards, the pulse of helicopters overhead when border patrols swept the desert, the way the earth itself seemed to hold its breath during dust storms. This was his ordinary world, caught between cultures, between sound and silence, between his parents' dreams and the reality of what their deaf son might achieve. He attended the school for the deaf 3 days a week and spent the other days with Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who taught him to read lips and spoke to him in a mixture of English, Spanish, and Mandarin that somehow made perfect sense. His friends were scattered across the city in the small, tight community of deaf children and their families, connected by specialized buses and weekend gatherings where hands flew in animated conversation. He was good at reading people's faces, at catching the emotions they tried to hide. He saw the way his mother's eyes lingered on families whose children chatted easily over dinner. He saw his father's hands clench when other men talked about their sons' baseball games or school plays. He saw the careful way neighbors spoke to his parents, the mixture of pity and admiration in their voices when they called Miguel special. But none of that prepared him for the weight of secrets that now pressed against his ribs like caged birds. The woman in white had given him more than a voice. She'd given him knowledge that could destroy the careful peace his family had built around their quiet life. The freight train's whistle faded into the distance, and Miguel realized his parents were both looking at him, waiting for some sign or reaction to the miraculous rose. He had a choice to make: remain safely silent in his ordinary world, or step into whatever strange destiny awaited him. The rose seemed to glow brighter in the morning sun, and Miguel felt the phantom warmth of otherworldly fingers against his throat. Miguel opened his mouth and felt the miracle happen again. "Mama," he said, the word emerging clear and perfect in Spanish. "Papa." The sound of his own voice still felt impossible, like watching someone else's lips move while feeling the vibrations bloom in his chest. Elena's laundry basket tumbled from her nerveless fingers, sending wet clothes across the dusty ground. Roberto froze mid-step, his work boot suspended above a struggling marigold. "Dios santo," Elena breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Miguel, you're—" "Speaking," he finished, marveling at how the word shaped itself on his tongue. Each syllable felt like a small explosion of warmth in his throat. "I can speak." Roberto sank heavily onto the porch steps, his face cycling through disbelief, wonder, and something that might have been terror. "How?" he whispered. "The doctors said. They said your vocal cords were fine, but without hearing—" Miguel's gaze drifted back to the impossible rose, its white petals catching the morning light like trapped starfire. How could he explain the woman in white? How could he describe the way her voice had filled his mind without sound, or the terrible weight of the secrets she'd entrusted to him? Instead of answering, he asked, "Do you know Mrs. Delgado on Elm Street?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke. Miguel watched his parents exchange a glance, the kind of loaded look that passed between married couples who'd learned to communicate in the spaces between words. Elena's face went carefully neutral, the same expression she wore when discussing bills they couldn't quite afford. "See, of course," Roberto said slowly. "She's been alone since Carlos died in the mine accident. Why do you ask?" The knowledge the woman had given him burned behind Miguel's ribs, demanding release. He could see it all with crystalline clarity: Carlos Delgado descending into darkness, his headlamp cutting through dusty air as he documented the cracking support beams that management had ordered him to ignore. The confrontation with Foreman Whitfield, the argument that turned deadly, the careful arrangement that made murder look like an unfortunate accident. "He didn't die in an accident," Miguel heard himself say, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Mr. Whitfield killed him because he found out about the safety violations. They made it look like an accident to cover up." "Basta!" Elena's sharp command cut through his revelation. She crossed herself rapidly, her face pale beneath her tan. "Miguel, you can't say such things. Carlos Delgado was a good man who died tragically, and making up stories—" "I'm not making it up." The certainty in his own voice surprised Miguel. He'd never felt so sure of anything in his 12 years of life. "The woman told me. The woman in the garden." Roberto stood abruptly, his construction worker's instincts reading danger in the conversation's direction. "What woman?" "Miguel, there was no one here but you." "She was real." Miguel pointed to where the luminous figure had knelt among the roses. "She touched the rose and made it bloom. She gave me my voice so I could deliver messages." Elena and Roberto exchanged another weighted glance. Miguel recognized the look. It was the same expression they'd worn during the endless medical consultations of his early childhood, when specialists had explained his condition with clinical detachment, while his parents struggled to understand what his silence would mean for their family's future. "Mijo," Elena said gently, kneeling beside him again. "Sometimes when we want something very badly, like the ability to speak, our minds can create experiences, dreams that feel real." It wasn't a dream. Miguel's voice grew stronger, more insistent. "She told me other things too, about missing children, about where to find them." Roberto's face went rigid. What children? The knowledge unspooled in Miguel's mind like thread from a spindle. 3 children who had vanished over the decades, their disappearances carefully spaced to avoid pattern recognition. Maria Santos, no relation despite the shared surname. Tommy Whitfield, the foreman's own nephew. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who had visited one summer and never returned home. "They're buried in the old mine shaft," Miguel said, the words emerging with prophetic certainty, "the one that was sealed after Carlos died. The woman showed me exactly where." Elena gasped, her hand pressing against her heart. Roberto's face had gone ashen, and Miguel realized with growing dread that his father recognized the names he'd spoken. "How could you possibly know about—" Roberto began, then stopped himself, his jaw working silently. A dust devil spun to life in the distance, dancing across the desert scrubland beyond their neighborhood's edge. Miguel watched it twist and dissipate, and felt his ordinary world crumbling like the wind-scattered earth. The safe silence he'd lived in for 12 years was gone, replaced by a voice that carried impossible truths and dangerous secrets. The rose pulsed with inner light, and Miguel understood that he stood at a crossroads. He could claim it had all been a dream, retreat back into silence, and let the buried truths remain buried. Or he could step forward into whatever destiny the woman in white had chosen for him. In the distance, church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to morning mass. The church bells echoed across the neighborhood like a countdown, each bronze note reverberating through Miguel's chest. He watched his parents' faces, his mother's eyes bright with unshed tears, his father's jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cables beneath his weathered skin. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the desert heat already building despite the early hour. Miguel's newfound voice sat in his throat like a caged bird, desperate to sing the terrible songs the woman in white had taught him. But looking at his parents, really seeing them, he felt the first sharp stab of doubt pierce through his certainty. What if he was wrong? What if his mind had finally cracked under the pressure of 12 years of enforced silence? He'd read about auditory hallucinations in the medical journals Mrs. Chen sometimes shared, about the brain's ability to create elaborate fantasies when deprived of normal sensory input. What if the woman in white was nothing more than his desperate imagination given form? "Miguel," Roberto said carefully, the way someone might address a wounded animal. "Son, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The things you're saying, they could hurt innocent people. Mrs. Delgado has suffered enough without—" "But what if they're true?" The question burst from Miguel before he could stop it. What if Mr. Whitfield really did kill Carlos? What if those children are really buried in the mine shaft? Wouldn't Mrs. Delgado want to know? Elena's face crumpled. "Oh, mijo, even if such terrible things were possible, and I'm not saying they are, but even if, some truths are too dangerous to speak. Some secrets are kept secret for good reasons." The admission hung between them like a visible thing. Miguel felt his stomach drop as he realized what his mother had just revealed. She believed him. On some level, she believed every word he'd spoken, and that belief terrified her more than the possibility that he was losing his mind. "You know something," he whispered. "Both of you. You know something about what happened." Roberto's calloused hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "There are things in this town, things that happened before you were born, things that good people decided were better left buried." "Who decided?" Miguel's voice cracked with the weight of his growing understanding. "Who gets to decide which truths can be told and which ones have to stay buried?" "The people with power," Elena said quietly. The people who can make life very difficult for families like ours. Miguel, we're not citizens who can afford to make waves. Your father's work, my job at the hospital, your schooling, all of it depends on staying invisible, staying quiet. The words hit Miguel like physical blows. He'd always known his family occupied a precarious position in Tucson's social hierarchy, legal residents who'd worked themselves to exhaustion for every small advancement, who spoke Spanish at home but English in public, who smiled politely when neighbors made comments about their kind taking jobs from real Americans. But he'd never fully grasped how that vulnerability shaped every decision, every conversation, every dream they dared to voice aloud. "So we just pretend?" Miguel asked. "We pretend that bad things don't happen, that people don't disappear, that murderers don't walk free?" "We survive," Roberto said firmly. "We protect our family. We don't go looking for trouble that could destroy everything we've built." Miguel looked down at the miraculous rose, its petals now seeming almost accusatory in their impossible perfection. The woman in white had called him a prophet, had spoken of burdens and bravery and the knife-edge balance between healing and harm, but she hadn't warned him about this. The crushing weight of family loyalty, the paralyzing fear of consequences that stretched far beyond himself. What would happen to his parents if he spoke the truths burning inside him? What would happen to Mrs. Delgado if he shattered her carefully constructed peace? What would happen to the families of the missing children if he led them to graves that someone had worked very hard to keep hidden? The church bells fell silent, leaving only the whisper of desert wind through the dying garden. Miguel felt the phantom touch of otherworldly fingers against his throat, the echo of a voice that had promised him purpose and power. But sitting here in the dirt with his parents' frightened faces before him, that divine certainty felt suddenly fragile, overwhelmed by very human fears. Maybe silence had been a blessing after all. Maybe some gifts were too dangerous to use. The rose pulsed within a light, and Miguel closed his eyes against its glow. The woman had given him a choice, and now he understood the true weight of it. He could retreat into the familiar safety of silence, protect his family from consequences he couldn't predict or control, or he could step forward into prophecy, armed with nothing but impossible truths and a voice that might not be strong enough to bear their weight. When he opened his eyes again, his parents were still watching him with expressions of desperate hope. Hope that their son would choose the safer path, would choose them over whatever destiny awaited in the speaking of dangerous words. Miguel felt the weight of their hope like chains around his ankles, pulling him back toward the familiar darkness of silence. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, he wavered on the precipice between two worlds, the safe harbor of his family's love and the treacherous waters of divine purpose. Then the rose released a pulse of light so brilliant it seemed to burn through his closed eyelids, and with it came the woman's voice, not as memory but as living presence. "Truth is not a burden to be carried, child. It is a gift to be given." Miguel's eyes snapped open. His parents were still watching him with that desperate, pleading expression, but now he could see past their fear to something deeper, a grief so old and buried it had become part of their foundation. They knew, they had always known, and their silence had been slowly poisoning them for years. "No," he said quietly, the word falling into the morning air like a stone into still water. Elena's face crumpled. "Miguel, please." "No," he repeated, stronger now. "I won't choose silence. Not anymore." He stood slowly, feeling the phantom touch of otherworldly fingers steadying him. The rose blazed with inner fire at his feet, and Miguel understood that this was his moment of choice, not just for himself, but for everyone whose truth had been buried in the name of safety, whose pain had been dismissed in the name of peace. "Mrs. Delgado deserves to know," he said, his voice growing clearer with each word. "The families of those children deserve to know. And you deserve to stop carrying secrets that aren't yours to bear." Roberto stepped forward, his face a mask of parental authority and desperate fear. "Miguel, I'm telling you as your father." "You're telling me as someone who's afraid," Miguel interrupted, and the words emerged with a certainty that surprised them all. But I'm not afraid anymore. It was true. The terror that had gripped him moments before was dissolving, replaced by something that felt like liquid light flowing through his veins. The woman's gift wasn't just speech, it was courage, the kind of fearless clarity that came from absolute certainty of purpose. Elena rose from her knees, dirt and tears staining her face. Mijo, what if you're wrong? What if this voice in your head is just— Then I'll be wrong, Miguel said simply, but I'll be wrong while trying to help people instead of wrong while staying silent. And if I'm right— He looked directly into his mother's eyes. If I'm right, then staying quiet makes us part of the lie. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything his family had built their lives around. Miguel saw his parents exchange that weighted glance again, but this time he recognized it for what it truly was. Not just marital communication, but the look of two people who had been holding their breath for so long they'd forgotten how to exhale. Roberto's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had been lifted from them. The Santos girl, he said quietly. Maria Santos. She was my cousin's daughter. Elena gasped. Roberto, no. She was 8 years old, he continued, his voice growing stronger. She disappeared the summer before Miguel was born. The police said she probably wandered into the desert, but— He swallowed hard. But she was afraid of the desert. She never would have gone out there alone. Miguel felt the truth of it resonate in his bones. You knew she was murdered. We suspected. But suspecting and proving are different things. And when you're poor and brown and the people you suspect are rich and white— Roberto spread his hands helplessly. What were we supposed to do? This, Miguel said firmly. Exactly this. Tell the truth. Let the light in. He knelt and touched the miraculous rose, feeling its petals warm beneath his fingers. The woman's presence flowed through him like electricity, filling him with words that weren't entirely his own. I'm going to Mrs. Delgado's house, he announced, standing again. I'm going to tell her what really happened to Carlos, and then I'm going to the police to tell them about the children. Elena stepped forward as if to block his path. Miguel, they won't believe you. A deaf boy who suddenly starts speaking, making wild accusations. Then I'll make them believe. Miguel's voice carried an authority that seemed far older than his 12 years. The woman showed me things. Details only the killer would know. Proof. Roberto studied his son's face with the same analytical expression he'd worn while examining the rose, searching for the logical explanation, the rational path forward. But Miguel could see the moment when his father stopped fighting the impossible and simply accepted it. What do you need from us? Roberto asked quietly. The question was capitulation and blessing combined. Miguel felt the last threads binding him to his old life snap like spider silk in a windstorm. There was no going back now. The threshold had been crossed. He was no longer Miguel Santos, the deaf boy who lived safely in silence. He was something else entirely, a voice for the voiceless, a light for the buried truth, a prophet with work to do. Miguel walked toward the house with purpose that felt both ancient and terrifyingly new, each step carrying him further from the boy he'd been an hour ago. Behind him, he could hear his parents' hushed voices, his mother's rapid Spanish prayers mixing with his father's quiet reassurances, but their words felt distant now, like sounds from another world. The neighborhood was stirring to life around him. Mrs. Chen emerged from her house to water her struggling marigolds, pausing midstream when she spotted Miguel walking alone down the sidewalk. Her eyes widened as they met his, not the usual polite acknowledgement she gave to the Santos family's silent boy, but something sharper, more calculating. Miguel felt the weight of her stare like a physical thing and wondered what his face revealed about the transformation taking place inside him. "Buenos dias, Miguel," she called out, her voice carefully neutral. "Buenos dias, Mrs. Chen," he replied, and watched her garden hose slip from nerveless fingers. Water pooled in the dirt around her feet as she stared at him, mouth slightly open. Miguel felt a flutter of something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been fear. The woman in white hadn't prepared him for this part, the way ordinary moments would become extraordinary, simply because he could participate in them now. You spoke," Mrs. Chen whispered. "Yes," Miguel said simply, and kept walking. Behind him, he heard the sharp intake of breath, followed by the rapid slap of sandals on concrete as Mrs. Chen hurried back toward her house, probably to call someone, to spread the news that the Santos boy had found his voice. Miguel realized with growing unease that his miracle would be neighborhood gossip before he'd even delivered his first message. The Delgado house sat at the end of Elm Street, like a period at the end of a sad sentence. The small adobe structure had seen better days, paint peeling from the window frames, roof tiles missing where desert storms had claimed them one by one. Carlos Delgado had been the family's primary breadwinner, and his widow's struggle showed in every deferred repair, every corner where poverty had taken residence. Miguel climbed the 3 concrete steps to the front door, each one feeling higher than the last. The knowledge the woman had given him pulsed behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. Carlos kneeling in the mine shaft, his headlamp illuminating the deliberately weakened support beam. The foreman's voice echoing off tunnel walls, demanding silence about safety violations that could shut down the operation. The argument that escalated until Whitfield's flashlight became a weapon, until Carlos's skull cracked like an egg against unforgiving stone. He raised his hand to knock just as the door swung open. Mrs. Delgado stood framed in the doorway, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her grief-carved face. She wore black as she had every day for the 3 years since Carlos's death, not the ceremonial black of fresh mourning, but the faded, practical black of someone who had made sorrow her permanent uniform. "Miguel Santos," she said, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone perpetually medicated against pain. "What brings you here, mijo?" The endearment, little son, hit Miguel like a physical blow. He could see the genuine affection in her tired eyes, the maternal warmth that even 3 years of devastating loss couldn't entirely extinguish. How could he shatter whatever fragile peace she'd managed to construct? How could he trade her grief for his truth? I came to talk to you about Carlos," he managed, his voice smaller than he'd intended. Mrs. Delgado's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a spark of the woman she'd been before tragedy had hollowed her out. "You never speak," she said quietly. "Everyone knows you never speak." "I speak now." She studied his face with the intensity of someone reading scripture, searching for meaning in every line and shadow. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. "Tell me what you have to say about my Carlos." The house's interior was a shrine to the dead man. Photographs covering every surface, his work clothes still hanging in the hallway closet, his coffee mug sitting clean and ready on the kitchen counter, as if he might return any moment to claim it. The air smelled of candle wax and old roses, devotion made tangible. Miguel felt the woman in white's presence strengthen around him, her otherworldly certainty flowing through his bones like liquid courage. This was why he'd been given voice, not for his own comfort, but for moments exactly like this one, when truth demanded to be spoken regardless of consequences. "Your husband didn't die in an accident," Miguel said, the words emerging with prophetic clarity. "He was murdered." Mrs. Delgado's face went perfectly still, like a mask carved from pale stone. But her hands began to shake. "Tell me," she whispered. And Miguel understood that some part of her had been waiting 3 years for someone to speak this truth aloud. Miguel felt the weight of her expectation settle around him like a heavy cloak. Mrs. Delgado moved through her shrine-like living room with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield, each step measured to avoid disturbing the careful arrangement of memories that kept her husband's presence alive. She gestured for him to sit on the worn sofa, its fabric faded where Carlos had once rested after long days in the mines. The impression of his body seemed permanently etched into the cushions, a ghost made of compressed foam and fabric. 3 years, Mrs. Delgado said, settling into the chair across from him. 3 years I've been telling myself it was an accident, that my Carlos was just unlucky. Her voice cracked on the last word, but I knew, somewhere deep inside I knew. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling the woman in white's knowledge flow through him like water through a broken dam. The visions came sharp and clear. Carlos discovering discrepancies in the mine's safety reports, Whitfield's increasingly aggressive attempts to silence him, the final confrontation that ended with blood on limestone walls. He found out about the violations, Miguel said, his voice carrying certainty that belonged to someone far older. The safety inspections that were falsified, the support beams that should have been replaced but weren't. Carlos was going to report it. Mrs. Delgado's hands clenched in her lap. He came home that last week so angry, kept talking about how the company was cutting corners, putting men at risk to save money. I told him, her voice broke, I told him to stay quiet, to not make waves. We needed his job. The admission hung between them like a confession. Miguel felt the terrible weight of her guilt, the corrosive belief that her caution had somehow caused her husband's death. He leaned forward, the woman's compassion flowing through him. It wouldn't have mattered, he said gently. Whitfield had already decided Carlos was too dangerous to keep alive. The argument in the mine shaft, it wasn't about convincing Carlos to stay quiet anymore, it was about silencing him permanently. Mrs. Delgado's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks as 3 years of suppressed suspicion came rushing to the surface. I knew he wouldn't have been careless. Carlos was the most safety-conscious man in that mine. He checked his equipment 3 times before every shift. And they wanted me to believe he just wandered into an unstable section? Miguel nodded, feeling the truth crystallize between them. Whitfield made it look like a cave-in, brought down the ceiling to hide what really happened, but Carlos was already dead when the rocks fell. The words emerged with such stark certainty that Miguel himself was startled by them. He wasn't just recounting the woman in white's visions anymore, he was living them, feeling Carlos's last moments as if they were his own memories. "My God," Mrs. Delgado whispered, "how could you possibly know these things? You were only 9 years old when Carlos died and you never spoke to anyone." Miguel met her gaze directly. "A woman came to me. In my grandmother's garden. She showed me things that happened, things that are hidden. She told me Carlos needs justice." Mrs. Delgado stared at him for a long moment, her grief-sharpened instincts weighing his words. "What woman? From where?" "I don't know," Miguel admitted. "She appeared in the roses, dressed in white. She spoke to me without sound, gave me words I'd never had before." He gestured around the shrine-like room. "She said the dead can't rest while their killers walk free." Something shifted in Mrs. Delgado's expression, surprise giving way to something deeper, more complex. She stood abruptly and walked to a small altar Carlos had built in the corner of the living room. Among the flickering votive candles and faded photographs stood a small statue of the Virgin of Guadalupe, her serene face gazing out over the assembled memories. "La Virgencita," Mrs. Delgado murmured, crossing herself. "I've been praying to her every night, begging for answers, asking her to show me the truth about what happened to my Carlos." Miguel felt a chill of recognition run down his spine. The woman in white's face had been obscured by luminous light, her features impossible to distinguish clearly. But now, looking at the statue's compassionate expression, he felt a resonance that made his breath catch. "She heard you," he said simply. Mrs. Delgado turned back to him, her tears now mixing with something that might have been hope. "What do we do? How do we prove what Whitfield did?" Miguel felt the woman's presence strengthen around him, filling him with purpose that burned like cold fire. "We go to the police. We make them listen, and if they won't—" He paused, feeling the weight of prophecy settle on his young shoulders. "Then we find another way to bring the truth to light." Mrs. Delgado nodded slowly, her spine straightening with newfound resolve. "Yes," she said, "it's time to stop being afraid." Outside, Miguel could hear the neighborhood stirring to full wakefulness. Soon, word of his miraculous voice would spread beyond Mrs. Chen's phone calls. The entire community would know that the silent Santos boy had found his tongue, and with it, he intended to speak truths that would shake their carefully constructed world to its foundations. The police station squatted like a concrete fortress on the corner of Main and 2nd Street, its institutional beige walls radiating the kind of authority that made innocent people feel guilty just walking past. Miguel stood on the sidewalk outside, Mrs. Delgado's trembling hand gripping his shoulder, both of them staring at the building that represented their last hope for justice, or their first real enemy. "Once we go in there," Mrs. Delgado whispered, "there's no taking it back. They'll either help us or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Miguel understood. "Or they'll protect Whitfield, or they'll think we're crazy, or they'll make us disappear, too." The woman in white's presence flickered around him like candlelight in a draught, weaker here in this place of civic power than it had been in the garden or Mrs. Delgado's shrine home. Miguel felt suddenly, terrifyingly alone with his impossible knowledge and his 12-year-old voice that had spoken for less than 3 hours. "Miguel? Miguel Santos?" They turned to find Sheriff Bradley Martinez approaching from the parking lot, his uniform crisp despite the morning heat, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention as he took in the unlikely pair. "Mrs. Delgado," he said, nodding respectfully, "I haven't seen you well, not since Carlos's funeral. How are you holding up?" Miguel watched the sheriff's face carefully, searching for signs of deception or conspiracy. But Martinez's concern seemed genuine, his weathered features carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from years of dealing with a community's pain. "Sheriff," Mrs. Delgado said, her voice stronger than Miguel had heard it all morning, "we need to talk to you. About Carlos." Something flickered in Martinez's eyes, surprise perhaps or wariness. "Of course. Come inside, both of you." They followed him through glass doors into a world of fluorescent lighting and industrial carpet, past a reception desk where a bored-looking clerk glanced up at Miguel with frank curiosity. "The miracle boy," her expression said. "The one who can suddenly speak." Martinez led them to a small office that smelled of coffee and old cigarettes, gesturing for them to sit in chairs that had seen better decades. He settled behind his desk and studied them both, with the patient expression of someone accustomed to hearing impossible stories. "Now then," he said gently. "What about Carlos?" Mrs. Delgado looked at Miguel, her eyes holding a question. "Are you sure? Are you ready for this?" Miguel felt the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment, his parents' desperate pleas for silence, Mrs. Chen's shocked face, the terrible knowledge burning in his chest like swallowed fire. Everything the woman in white had shown him crystallized into absolute certainty. "Carlos Delgado was murdered," Miguel said, his voice carrying across the small office with startling clarity, "by Whitfield, in the mine shaft. It wasn't an accident." Sheriff Martinez went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully and leaned forward, his full attention now focused on the boy who wasn't supposed to be able to speak. "Miguel," he said slowly, "everyone in this town knows you've never spoken before, not a single word in 12 years. And now you're here making accusations about a death that happened 3 years ago. I need you to explain what's going on." Miguel felt the first tremor of real fear since leaving his grandmother's garden. This was it, the moment when his impossible truth would either be accepted or destroy everything. He closed his eyes and reached for the woman's presence, but found only the faintest whisper of otherworldly certainty. "I know things," he said, opening his eyes to meet Martinez's steady gaze, "about what really happened down there, about the falsified safety reports, about Carlos discovering that support Beam 6 Alpha had been marked for replacement 8 months before the cave-in, but Whitfield ordered the paperwork buried." Sheriff Martinez's expression shifted subtly, surprise giving way to something sharper, more dangerous. "How could you possibly know about Beam 6 Alpha?" The question hit Miguel like a physical blow. Martinez knew about the beam, which meant either the sheriff was part of the conspiracy or— "You investigated," Miguel whispered. "You found evidence." "I found a lot of things," Martinez said carefully, "but finding and proving are different matters entirely. especially when the only witness was buried under a ton of limestone. Mrs. Delgado leaned forward, hope blazing in her eyes. "What did you find?" "Please, Sheriff. I've been living with questions for 3 years." Martinez was quiet for a long moment, studying them both with the expression of a man weighing terrible risks. Finally, he opened his desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder marked with Carlos's name. "What I'm about to show you," he said quietly, "could get us all killed. James Whitfield has connections that reach far beyond this little town. City council, state legislature, federal mining regulators. He's protected by people who profit from his willingness to cut corners." Miguel felt the woman's presence surge around him suddenly, her certainty flowing back into his bones like liquid courage. This was the moment she had prepared him for, not just speaking truth, but facing the consequences of that truth. "Show us," he said, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed to surprise them all. "It's time for the dead to have their justice." Martinez spread the folder's contents across his desk like tarot cards predicting doom. Photographs of twisted metal beams, photocopied safety reports with suspicious whiteout marks, witness statements that had been typed and retyped until their original meaning vanished into bureaucratic doublespeak. "I've been building this case for 2 years, Martinez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every piece of evidence you see here could disappear tomorrow if the wrong people find out I have it." Miguel leaned forward, studying a photograph of Beam 6 Alpha. Even in the black and white image, he could see the deliberate scoring marks where someone had weakened the metal, the precise cuts disguised to look like natural stress fractures. "This proves Carlos was right," Mrs. Delgado breathed. "This proves—" The office door exploded open. James Whitfield filled the doorway like a malevolent thundercloud, his expensive suit somehow making him appear more dangerous rather than civilized. Behind him stood 2 men Miguel didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, cold-eyed, the kind of men who solved problems with silence. "Sheriff Martinez," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I understand you're entertaining some very disturbing accusations this morning." Martinez's hand moved instinctively toward the evidence scattered across his desk, but Whitfield's men were already stepping forward. Miguel watched in horror as 3 years of painstaking investigation disappeared into their briefcases like it had never existed at all. "You can't do this," Mrs. Delgado whispered, but her voice carried no real conviction. She had lived in Tucson long enough to understand how power worked, how men like Whitfield moved through the world untouchable. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Whitfield said, his attention now focused entirely on Miguel. "This boy has been telling some very creative stories, about women in gardens, about impossible visions, about things that happened when he was just a child who couldn't even speak." Miguel felt the woman's presence flickering around him like a candle in a hurricane, her certainty wavering under the weight of Whitfield's terrible confidence. For the first time since finding his voice, Miguel truly understood what he was facing, not just one corrupt man, but an entire system designed to protect him. "The tragic reality," Whitfield continued, "is that young Miguel here is clearly experiencing some kind of psychological break. First manifestation of speech after years of selective mutism, accompanied by elaborate delusions. It's actually quite common." Sheriff Martinez's face had gone grey. Miguel could see the man's entire world crumbling, his case, his evidence, his careful plans for justice all disappearing into the machinery of corruption that kept Whitfield untouchable. "I've already spoken with Dr. Patricia Henley at the State Psychiatric Facility," Whitfield said, producing a manila folder of his own. "She's prepared to begin immediate evaluation and treatment. For Miguel's own protection, of course." The words hit Miguel like physical blows. They were going to lock him away, declare him insane, make his miraculous voice into evidence of mental illness rather than divine intervention. "No," Mrs. Delgado said, standing shakily. "You can't take him. He's not sick. He's—" He's a 12-year-old boy making wild accusations about things he couldn't possibly know, Whitfield interrupted. Unless, of course, someone has been filling his head with dangerous ideas, someone with a history of grief-related delusions. The threat was unmistakable. Take Miguel, and they'd come for Mrs. Delgado next. Miguel felt the last of his supernatural confidence crumble away. The woman in white's presence faded to barely a whisper, leaving him alone with his small voice and his impossible knowledge in a room full of people who held all the power. "Where are the other children?" Miguel asked desperately, playing his final card. "Where are the ones who disappeared? I know where they're buried. I know." Whitfield's expression didn't change, but something arctic settled in his eyes. Dr. Henley will be very interested in these elaborate fantasies. Very interested indeed. One of Whitfield's men stepped forward, his hand resting gently but unmistakably on Miguel's shoulder. The touch was almost paternal, but Miguel could feel the steel beneath it, the promise of what would happen if he resisted. "The evaluation will begin this afternoon," Whitfield said, "for everyone's safety." Miguel looked at Mrs. Delgado, saw his own terror reflected in her eyes, then at Sheriff Martinez, who couldn't even meet his gaze. The man's hands were shaking as he stared at his empty desk, at the space where Carlos Delgado's justice had briefly existed before being erased. They had lost. The truth wasn't enough. The woman's visions weren't enough. His miraculous voice wasn't enough. In the fluorescent-lit silence of that government office, Miguel finally understood what the woman in white had been preparing him for. Not victory, but sacrifice. The hand on Miguel's shoulder tightened almost imperceptibly, and in that moment of contact, something extraordinary happened. The fluorescent light seemed to dim as a deeper knowing flooded through him, not the woman in white's gentle visions this time, but something raw and electric that felt like touching a live wire. Miguel saw Whitfield as he truly was. Not just a corrupt mine owner, but something far more monstrous. Images crashed through Miguel's consciousness with brutal clarity, children's faces twisted in terror, small hands clawing at wooden boxes, the sound of earth being shoveled over muffled screams. And standing over it all, Whitfield's younger face, his eyes holding the same arctic emptiness they held now. "You're not just protecting mining profits," Miguel said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "You're protecting yourself from what you did to Maria Sandoval, to Tommy Chen, to little Elena Rodriguez." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Sheriff Martinez's head snapped up, his face draining of all color. Mrs. Delgado gasped, recognizing names that had haunted the community for decades. But it was Whitfield's reaction that confirmed everything. A micro-expression of pure panic that flashed across his features before the mask of control slammed back into place. "Those children disappeared 15 years ago," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. "The cases went cold. We never found." Miguel felt the woman's presence surge back around him, not gentle this time, but blazing with righteous fury. The truth poured from him like water through a broken dam. "They found your private photographs. The ones you took of them at the company picnics. Maria Sandoval was going to tell her parents about the special games you wanted to play, so you took her to the old mine shaft, the one everyone thought was abandoned." Whitfield's composure cracked completely. "You little—" "They're not buried separately," Miguel continued, the visions flowing through him with devastating clarity. "You put them all in the same place, Shaft 7. Behind the false wall you built. You told everyone it was unsafe, had it condemned so no one would ever go back there." The man whose hand rested on Miguel's shoulder had gone statue still. Sheriff Martinez was standing now, his face cycling through shock, horror, and growing rage. Mrs. Delgado was staring at Whitfield with the expression of someone seeing a demon wearing human skin. 15 years, Martinez said, his voice gaining strength. 15 years those families have wondered. 15 years of searching and hoping and praying their children might still be alive somewhere. Miguel felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place with terrible certainty. "That's why you killed Carlos." Not because he found out about the safety violations, because he was working in Shaft 7, because he was getting too close to the wall. The room erupted into chaos. Whitfield lunged toward Miguel, his civilized mask finally dropping completely, but Sheriff Martinez intercepted him with the fury of a man who had just discovered that his community's greatest tragedy was actually its greatest crime. They crashed into the desk, sending coffee and papers flying. Mrs. Delgado grabbed Miguel, pulling him away from Whitfield's remaining man, who seemed frozen by the sudden dissolution of his employer's untouchable authority. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously as bodies collided and voices rose to shouts. But in the midst of the physical struggle, Miguel felt a profound stillness descend over him. The woman in white materialized in the corner of the room, not as the gentle gardener he had first encountered, but as something far more powerful. Her face was no longer obscured by luminous light. Miguel could see her clearly now, and the recognition hit him like a thunderbolt. She wasn't the Virgin of Guadalupe. She wasn't any saint or divine messenger. She was Elena Rodriguez, the 8-year-old girl who had disappeared on a summer afternoon 15 years ago, whose parents still left flowers at the desert shrine every week, whose face smiled out from faded missing person flyers that had never been taken down. Elena's ghost met Miguel's eyes across the chaos of the sheriff's office, and he understood everything at last. The woman in white had never been coming to save him or grant him divine gifts. She had been trying to save herself and the other children trapped behind Whitfield's wall. She had chosen Miguel not because he was special, but because he was innocent, because his deafness had kept him pure from the corruption and compromise that infected every other adult in their community. His voice had never been the miracle. The miracle was that the dead had finally found someone willing to speak for them. "Shaft 7. Miguel said, his words cutting through the struggle like a bell-tolling judgment. "Behind the wall marked with the red 10th, that's where you'll find them. All of them." Elena's ghost smiled at him one last time, her form already beginning to fade as justice finally, impossibly, began to unfold. The revelation was complete. Everything had shifted, and there was no going back. The chaos in the sheriff's office seemed to freeze for an eternal moment after Miguel's final words. Sheriff Martinez had Whitfield pinned against the overturned desk, both men breathing hard, while Mrs. Delgado held Miguel protectively against her side. Whitfield's security man stood paralyzed, his hand hovering near his jacket as if unsure whether to draw a weapon or flee. Then Elena's ghost was gone, and time crashed back into motion. "Shaft 7, Martinez repeated, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and dawning comprehension. "Jesus Christ! We searched everywhere but the condemned sections." He loosened his grip on Whitfield slightly, but his eyes never left the mine owner's face. "You condemned that shaft yourself, said it was structurally unsound." Miguel felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a subtle change in the balance of power. Whitfield's man was backing toward the door, his loyalty apparently extending only as far as his employer's apparent invincibility. When that facade cracked, Rats abandoned ship quickly. "You have no proof," Whitfield snarled, but his voice carried a desperate edge that hadn't been there minutes before. "The fantasies of a disturbed child and a grieving woman prove nothing." "Then you won't mind if we take a look," Martinez said, reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Martinez. I need a full forensics team and the county coroner at the old Esperanza mine site, Shaft 7 specifically." "Sheriff," Whitfield's voice took on a pleading quality that made Miguel's skin crawl. "Think about what you're doing. Think about your pension, your daughter's college fund, the new equipment budget you've been fighting for. Think about who controls those things in this county." Miguel watched Sheriff Martinez's face carefully, saw the moment when 15 years of accumulated doubt and guilt crystallized into unshakable resolve. "I'm thinking about 3 children who never came home," Martinez said quietly. "I'm thinking about families who've been living in hell because I wasn't good enough at my job to catch a monster." Mrs. Delgado's grip on Miguel's shoulder tightened protectively. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Now we find them," Miguel said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. Elena's presence had faded, but she had left something behind, a deep, quiet strength that felt like borrowed courage. And then we bring them home. Martinez was already moving, grabbing keys and equipment with the efficiency of someone who had waited too long to act. "Mrs. Delgado, I need you to take Miguel somewhere safe. Whitfield's got friends, and when word gets out about this investigation, things could get dangerous fast." "Where?" she asked. "If he has the kind of connections you mentioned." "My grandmother's house," Miguel interrupted. The words came from some instinctive wisdom he didn't fully understand. "Take me back to where this started. That's where we'll be protected." Martinez nodded grimly. "Smart kid. Sacred ground is hard to corrupt." He turned to face Whitfield, who was straightening his expensive suit with shaking hands. "James Whitfield, you're under arrest for suspicion of murder in the deaths of Maria Sandoval, Thomas Chen, and Elena Rodriguez. You have the right to remain silent." "This is a mistake," Whitfield said, but his voice had lost all its commanding authority. "You're destroying yourself, Martinez. Destroying this whole community. When my lawyers are finished—" "Your lawyers can meet us at the mine," Martinez said, snapping handcuffs around Whitfield's wrists. "I have a feeling they're going to be very busy very soon." Miguel watched Whitfield being led away and felt no satisfaction, only a profound exhaustion. The truth was finally being spoken, but he understood now that truth was just the beginning. Justice would be harder. Justice would require the whole community to confront what they had allowed to happen in their midst. "Come on, mijo," Mrs. Delgado said gently, guiding him toward the door. "Let's get you home." As they stepped out into the blazing Arizona afternoon, Miguel felt the weight of what lay ahead settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. There would be questions from police, from reporters, from his own family. There would be disbelief and accusations and probably attempts to discredit him. Whitfield's connections wouldn't disappear just because he was in handcuffs. But there would also be Elena, Maria, and Tommy finally coming home to families who had never stopped looking for them. There would be Carlos Delgado's name cleared and his widow's grief transformed into something approaching peace. There would be truth where lies had festered for 15 years. "Mrs. Delgado," Miguel said as they walked toward her car. "I'm scared." She stopped and knelt down to meet his eyes, her weathered hands gentle on his face. "Me too, mijo. But sometimes being scared just means you understand how important something is." Miguel nodded, feeling Elena's borrowed strength steady him. He had found his voice for a reason, and that reason wasn't finished with him yet. The drive to his grandmother's house passed in heavy silence, Mrs. Delgado's knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated streets that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. Miguel pressed his face against the passenger window, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past while his mind churned with the magnitude of what they had set in motion. The truth was out there now, spreading through Tucson like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. By evening, everyone would know. The families of the missing children, the media, Whitfield's powerful friends who had helped maintain the silence for 15 years. "They'll try to stop this," Miguel said quietly, the words heavy with certainty he wished he didn't possess. Mrs. Delgado glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Probably. Men like Whitfield don't go down without a fight." But Sheriff Martinez seemed... "Sheriff Martinez is one man, mijo, and there are a lot of people in this town who've benefited from looking the other way." Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had learned not to trust in the goodness of institutions. "Your family needs to know what's coming. They need to be prepared." As they turned onto the familiar street, lined with small adobe houses and struggling desert gardens, Miguel felt his stomach clench with dread. How could he explain any of this to his parents, to his grandmother who had raised him to see miracles in everyday faith? The story sounded impossible even to him, and he had lived every moment of it. Mrs. Delgado pulled into the driveway behind his father's pickup truck. Through the screen door, Miguel could hear the afternoon telenovela playing on the television, his mother's voice calling something to his grandmother in the kitchen. Normal sounds from a normal life that was about to be shattered by the truth he carried. "I don't know how to tell them," Miguel admitted, his newfound voice feeling small and inadequate. The same way you told Sheriff Martinez, Mrs. Delgado said, turning off the engine. With honesty. Your family loves you, Miguel. They'll stand with you no matter what comes next. But even as she spoke the words, Miguel could see the doubt in her eyes. His parents were practical people, devout but grounded in the realities of work and bills and survival. His miraculous recovery of speech had been blessing enough to accept visions of murdered children and corrupt mine owners might be more than their faith could accommodate. The front door opened before they reached the porch. His mother appeared, her face immediately creased with worry at the sight of Mrs. Delgado's grim expression. "Miguel? ¿Qué pasó?" "Mama," Miguel said, his voice catching slightly. "We need to talk, all of us. It's about why I can speak now. It's about everything." His father emerged from the kitchen, dish towel still in his hands, his weathered face already hardening with the defensive wariness of a man who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Mrs. Delgado," he said carefully, "is there trouble?" "There's going to be," she replied with characteristic directness. "Your son has done something very brave today, and very dangerous. The whole community is about to learn what kind of man James Whitfield really is." Miguel watched his parents exchange the kind of quick, wordless communication that came from 20 years of marriage and shared hardship. His father's shoulders tensed, his mother's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where she wore the small silver cross that had belonged to her own mother. "Inside," his father said quietly, "before the neighbors start talking." They gathered in the small living room, where Miguel had spent countless silent afternoons, where he had learned to read lips and communicate through gestures and facial expressions, where his family had created their own language of love that transcended speech. His grandmother emerged from the kitchen, her ancient eyes sharp with concern as she took in the assembled faces. "Abuela," Miguel began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the weight of what he needed to say. How could he explain that the woman in white who had given him his voice wasn't a saint, but the ghost of a murdered child? How could he tell them that their miracle was born from unspeakable tragedy? "Start with the garden," Mrs. Delgado suggested gently. "Start with what you saw." So Miguel began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. He told them about Elena's appearances, about the messages he had been compelled to deliver, about the horrible truth that had been hidden beneath Tucson's desert soil for 15 years. He watched his family's faces change as the story unfolded, confusion giving way to horror, then to a kind of terrible understanding. When he finished, the silence stretched long and heavy. Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder as it headed toward the old mine. "They'll come for us next," his father said finally. "Whitfield's people. They'll try to discredit Miguel, maybe threaten the family." Miguel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him again, heavier now because it encompassed not just the dead children, but everyone he loved. The road back to normal life was already disappearing behind them. There was only the path forward now, through whatever storm was coming. But looking around at his family's faces, Miguel saw not fear but resolve. They believed him, they would stand with him. The final confrontation was coming, and he would not face it alone. The telephone rang, piercing the heavy silence like a blade. Miguel's father moved to answer it, his face grim with anticipation. The voice on the other end was loud enough for everyone to hear, angry, threatening, promising consequences if that boy didn't recant his lies immediately. His father hung up without responding, then unplugged the phone from the wall. "It begins," Mrs. Delgado said quietly. Miguel's grandmother stepped forward, her weathered hands surprisingly steady as she placed them on his shoulders. "Mijo," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades. "Tell me about the woman in the garden. Tell me exactly what she looked like." "Abuela, I already..." "Tell me again. Every detail." Miguel closed his eyes, summoning Elena's image with perfect clarity. She was small, maybe 8 years old if she had lived. dark hair in braids with red ribbons, a white dress with tiny flowers embroidered on the collar. And her eyes— He paused, understanding flooding through him. Her eyes were exactly like yours, abuela, like Mama's, like the old photographs of Tia Rosa. His grandmother's sharp intake of breath cut through the room. Elena Rodriguez was your cousin, Miguel, your great-uncle Manuel's granddaughter. That's why she came to you. That's why she could reach you. The revelation hit Miguel like cold water. Family. Elena wasn't just any murdered child seeking justice. She was blood, reaching across death to the one person in their line who could hear beyond the veil of silence that had protected killers for 15 years. The garden, his grandmother continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. That garden has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-great-grandmother planted those roses when she first came north from Sonora. Elena came home, mijo. She came home to family ground to ask for help. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. Multiple engines, the crunch of tires on gravel. Miguel moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the curb, men in expensive suits climbing out with the predatory efficiency of wolves. They're here, he whispered. His father moved to stand beside him, his work-calloused hands clenching into fists. Whitfield's lawyers, and probably some of his other friends. Mrs. Delgado was already reaching for her purse. I'm calling Sheriff Martinez. No signal, Miguel's mother said, checking her cell phone. They're jamming everything. Miguel felt Elena's presence returning, not gentle this time, but blazing with protective fury. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and the roses in his grandmother's garden outside began to glow with an otherworldly light visible even through the closed curtains. They can't touch us here, Miguel said, the words coming from knowledge he didn't consciously possess. This is sacred ground, family ground. Elena won't let them. A sharp knock echoed from the front door, followed by a voice dripping with false authority. Open up. We need to speak with the Santos family regarding false statements made to law enforcement. Miguel's father started toward the door, but his grandmother caught his arm. No, Roberto, let them knock, let them shout. This is our home, and they have no power here. The knocking grew more insistent, accompanied by threats about obstruction of justice and legal consequences. But something strange was happening outside. Miguel could hear confusion in their voices, the sound of grown men becoming disoriented and uncertain. What the hell? Where did the road go? GPS isn't working. Nothing's working. Miguel pressed his face against the window and gasped. The street beyond their property line was simply gone, replaced by an endless expanse of desert that stretched to the horizon. The black SUVs sat in their driveway like islands in an ocean of sand and sagebrush, their occupants stumbling around in growing panic. Elena, he whispered, and saw her standing in the garden among the impossibly blooming roses, no longer hiding her true nature. She was magnificent and terrible, a child's innocence transformed into an angel of justice, protecting her family with power drawn from 15 years of righteous anger. She's buying us time, his grandmother said, her voice filled with awe and pride. But this won't last forever, mijo. When the sun sets, the protection will fade, and they'll remember how to find us. Miguel nodded, understanding flooding through him with crystal clarity. This was his final test, not just to speak truth, but to make that truth heard by the entire world before Whitfield's people could silence it forever. I need to get to the mine, he said, his voice steady with new resolve. I need to be there when Sheriff Martinez finds the children. I need to witness it so nobody can claim it didn't happen. His father shook his head immediately. Too dangerous. Whitfield's people. We'll try to stop this whether I hide or not, Miguel interrupted. But Elena chose me for a reason. She gave me a voice so the dead could finally speak. I won't waste that gift by staying silent when it matters most. Outside, the confused shouts were growing more desperate. The final confrontation had begun, and Miguel knew with absolute certainty that everything, Justice, truth, the souls of 3 murdered children depended on what happened next. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of blood and gold. As Miguel emerged from his grandmother's house, Elena's otherworldly protection shimmering around him like heat waves. The black SUVs remained trapped in their bubble of displaced reality, their occupants now huddled together in obvious terror as the familiar world continued to dissolve around them. "I'm coming with you," his father said, reaching for the truck keys. Miguel's voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "This has to be me. Elena chose me, and if anyone else tries to interfere, her protection might break." Mrs. Delgado stepped forward, her weathered face set with determination. "Then I drive. I got you into this, mijo. I'll see it through to the end." Miguel nodded, understanding that some debts could only be paid in person. As they climbed into her car, he could feel Elena's presence settling around him like armor, cold and fierce and absolutely certain of purpose. The drive to the Esperanza mine took them through a Tucson transformed by supernatural intervention. Street lights flickered and died as they passed. Radio signals dissolved into static. Cell towers stood dark and silent. Elena was ensuring that no one could coordinate efforts to stop what was coming. "Sheriff Martinez won't be able to call for backup," Mrs. Delgado observed, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "He won't need it," Miguel replied, though he wasn't sure how he knew. "Everything that's supposed to happen will happen. Elena has been planning this for 15 years. They reached the mine as full darkness settled over the desert. Sheriff Martinez's patrol car sat alone near the entrance to Shaft 7, its headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. The sheriff himself stood near the opening, a portable radio crackling uselessly in his hand. "Martinez!" A new voice boomed across the mining site. James Whitfield emerged from behind a pile of abandoned equipment, no longer in handcuffs, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who radiated the cold competence of professional fixers. "This has gone far enough." Miguel felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he climbed out of the car. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Whitfield stood 20 feet away, his silver hair perfect despite his ordeal, his eyes burning with the fury of a man who had never been truly challenged. "How did you get here?" Sheriff Martinez demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "You were in custody." "I have friends, Martinez, friends who understand that sometimes the greater good requires difficult decisions." Whitfield's voice carried the absolute confidence of someone accustomed to buying his way out of consequences. "Friends who can make problems disappear, including you if necessary." Miguel stepped into the circle of light cast by the headlights, and he felt the moment when everyone present recognized that this 12-year-old boy had somehow become the center around which all their fates revolved. "Miguel," Whitfield said, his tone shifting to something approaching gentleness. "Son, you've been through a trauma. Someone has filled your head with terrible stories, made you believe things that aren't true. But we can fix this. Medical treatment. A new life somewhere far from here. Your family would never want for anything." "My family already has everything they need," Miguel replied, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. "The truth." Whitfield's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the predator beneath. "The truth is that 3 children died in an accident 15 years ago. A tragedy, certainly, but not a crime. Their remains were moved to protect the community from unnecessary grief and economic disruption. Everything I did was for the greater good of Tucson." "You killed them." The words came from Miguel's lips, but Elena's fury powered them. "You murdered 3 children to hide your illegal dumping. You poisoned the water table and covered it up with their blood." "Prove it," Whitfield snarled, abandoning all pretense. "Prove any of it. Without evidence, you're just a disturbed little boy telling ghost stories." Miguel smiled then, and in that smile was Elena's terrible joy. "I don't have to prove anything. They will." The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. From the depths of Shaft 7 came a sound like wind through desert canyons, carrying voices that had been silenced for 15 years. The darkness around the mine entrance started to glow with soft, phosphorescent light, and 3 small figures emerged from the earth where they had been hidden. Elena Rodriguez, still 8 years old, her white dress somehow pristine despite a decade and a half underground. Maria Sandoval, clutching the doll she had been carrying when Whitfield's men caught her. Tommy Chen, his school backpack still strapped to his shoulders, his young face serene despite the violence of his death. They stood in perfect silence, 3 murdered children finally come home to bear witness against their killer. Whitfield's scream of terror shattered the desert night, and Miguel knew that justice had finally found its voice. The screaming stopped abruptly as Whitfield collapsed to his knees, his silver hair wild in the supernatural wind that emanated from the mine shaft. His expensive lawyers had already fled, disappearing into the desert darkness with animal panic. Only Sheriff Martinez remained, his weathered face pale but resolute as he stared at the 3 luminous children who had emerged from 15 years of buried silence. "Jesus Cristo," he whispered, crossing himself. Elena stepped forward, her ghostly radiance casting long shadows across the mining site. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of cosmic justice, reaching every ear despite the absence of sound. "Tell them, Miguel. Tell them how we died." Miguel felt the words forming in his throat, but they weren't his anymore. Elena's memories flooded through him, the terror of being chased through desert scrub, the confusion when Whitfield's men cornered them near the illegal dump site, the desperate attempt to run that ended in violence and shallow graves. "They were just playing," Miguel said, his young voice trembling with ancient pain, "exploring where they shouldn't have been, but they saw the barrels. The chemical waste your company was dumping to avoid disposal costs." Whitfield raised his head, his eyes wide with madness. "They would have told. 3 little brats would have destroyed everything I'd built, everything this community needed. So you killed them." Sheriff Martinez's hand moved to his weapon, though Miguel sensed the lawman understood these weren't criminals who could be arrested in any conventional sense. 3 children, murdered to protect your profit margins. Elena's form blazed brighter, and Miguel felt her rage like fire in his chest. But beneath the fury was something else, a terrible sadness that cut deeper than any anger could. She had missed her quinceañera, her graduation, her wedding day. Maria would never become the teacher she dreamed of being. Tommy would never follow his father into engineering. "The sacrifice," Miguel whispered, suddenly understanding what Elena had been trying to tell him all along. "This isn't just about justice. It's about what has to be given up to achieve it." Elena turned to him, her ancient eyes filled with love and sorrow. "You know what I'm asking, Primo. You've always known." Miguel's heart clenched as the full weight of her request crashed over him. To expose the truth completely, to ensure that Whitfield could never escape or corrupt the evidence, someone had to remain as witness. Someone had to cross the threshold and speak for all the dead who had been silenced by power and money over the years. His voice would have to join theirs, forever. "Miguel, no!" Mrs. Delgado lunged toward him, but an invisible barrier held her back. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Miguel said, his newfound speech already beginning to carry the ethereal quality of Elena's voice. "This is why she gave me words, not just to speak truth, but to make sure it can never be silenced again." He looked back toward Mrs. Delgado, memorizing her face. He thought of his parents waiting at home, his grandmother's weathered hands, the normal life he would never return to, the birthday parties he would miss, the baseball games, the girl he might have loved someday. All of it dissolved into acceptance. "Tell my family I chose this," he said. "Tell them I finally understand what miracles really cost." Elena extended her small hand, and Miguel took it without hesitation. The moment their fingers touched, the world exploded into brilliant white light. He felt his physical form dissolving, his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. The pain of separation from everything he had ever known was overwhelming, but it lasted only a moment before being replaced by something vast and eternal. When the light faded, 4 ghost children stood before the mine entrance. Miguel Santos, 12 years old forever, his school uniform still neat despite his transformation. He opened his mouth and spoke with a voice that would carry across time itself, a voice that no court could dismiss, no lawyer could discredit, no amount of money could silence. "We are the children of Tucson," he declared, his words echoing across dimensions. "We are the ones who were forgotten, who were buried for convenience, who were sacrificed to protect the comfortable lives of adults. We will speak now for every silenced voice, every covered-up crime, every child whose death was deemed acceptable collateral damage." Sheriff Martinez fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the supernatural authority radiating from the four young witnesses. Even Whitfield stopped his mad ravings, finally understanding that he faced judgment from a court that recognized no earthly appeals. The desert wind carried Miguel's voice toward the lights of Tucson, where his family would soon learn the price of the miracle they had celebrated. Justice had found its eternal witnesses, but the cost was measured in everything a 12-year-old boy would never have the chance to become. The silence that followed was absolute, not the mere absence of sound, but the profound quiet that comes when the universe pauses to acknowledge a fundamental shift in the balance of justice and sacrifice. Sheriff Martinez remained on his knees, his radio crackling with static as normal communications slowly returned to the desert. Mrs. Delgado stood frozen beside her car, tears streaming down her weathered face as she stared at the four luminous children who now existed beyond the reach of earthly law, but within the jurisdiction of something far more ancient and implacable. James Whitfield had stopped screaming. The man who had built an empire on buried secrets now sat in the dust like a broken doll, his expensive suit torn, his silver hair wild with the supernatural wind that still emanated from the mine shaft. When he finally looked up at the ghostly witnesses, his eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had finally run out of people to buy and problems to bury. "It's over," he whispered, the words barely audible. 40 years of building, of creating jobs, of making this community prosper, destroyed by 3 children who couldn't mind their own business. Miguel's ethereal voice cut through the night with surgical precision. "Prosperity built on poison isn't prosperity at all, Mr. Whitfield. It's just another kind of grave." The 4 children stood in perfect formation before the mine entrance, their combined radiance casting long shadows across equipment that had sat rusted and forgotten for decades. Elena stepped forward, her ghostly form more solid now, more real, as if Miguel's sacrifice had somehow anchored all of them more firmly to the world of the living. "Show them," she said to Miguel, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of patient waiting. "Show them what was hidden." Miguel nodded and moved toward Shaft 7. At his approach, the earth itself seemed to respond, the dry desert soil shifting and rolling as if invisible hands were excavating from below. The concrete cap that had sealed the shaft for over a decade cracked down the middle, revealing the darkness beneath. Sheriff Martinez forced himself to his feet, his professional instincts overriding his terror. "I need to call this in. The state police, the FBI." "No need," Miguel said, his young voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple dimensions. "They're already coming. They felt it when I crossed over. Truth this big creates ripples that reach everywhere." Even as he spoke, the distant sound of helicopters began to echo across the desert. Not Whitfield's people this time. Miguel could sense the difference. These were federal agents, investigators, reporters. The supernatural events of the evening had been felt far beyond Tucson, registering on instruments and in the dreams of sensitive individuals across the southwestern United States. Mrs. Delgado found her voice at last. "Miguel, mijo, your family. How do I tell them?" Miguel turned to her, and despite his ghostly transformation, she could still see the 12-year-old boy who had trusted her with impossible secrets. "Tell them I kept my promise. Tell them the dead can finally rest." "And tell them," Elena added, moving to stand beside her cousin, "that love transcends death. That family bonds can't be broken by bullets or buried under concrete. We're still here. We're still their children." Whitfield struggled to his feet, swaying like a man who had aged 20 years in the space of an hour. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice cracking. "The jobs that will be lost, the investigations, the lawsuits. This will destroy everything. Everything that needed destroying," Sheriff Martinez said, finding his courage at last. He reached for his handcuffs, though he wasn't entirely sure what good earthly restraints would do in the presence of supernatural witnesses. "James Whitfield, you're under arrest for the murders of Elena Rodriguez, Maria Sandoval, and Tommy Chen." As he spoke the words, something fundamental shifted in the desert air. The 4 ghost children began to fade, their mission finally complete after 15 years of waiting. But they didn't disappear entirely. Instead, they seemed to settle into the landscape itself, becoming part of the eternal witness that the desert provides to all human folly. Miguel felt his consciousness expanding, touching minds across Tucson as sleeping families suddenly woke with the absolute knowledge that their missing children were finally at peace. In a modest house on the south side, his parents embraced each other and wept, understanding without words that their miracle had required the ultimate sacrifice. "We'll remember," Mrs. Delgado called out to the fading spirits. "We'll make sure everyone remembers what you did." The last thing Miguel experienced as his individual consciousness merged with something larger was Elena's hand in his, warm despite the ethereal nature of their existence. They had found each other across death and silence, family connected by blood and sacrifice and an unshakable commitment to truth. The desert wind carried their voices toward the lights of Tucson, where justice would finally have its day in earthly courts. But more importantly, it carried the knowledge that some prices once paid purchase eternal peace. The children were home at last. The return. The sun rose over Tucson 3 days later, casting long shadows across a city forever changed. In the modest house, where the Santos family had once celebrated their deaf son's miraculous first words, a different kind of miracle was quietly taking shape. The slow, painful process of understanding that love transcends even the ultimate sacrifice. Carmen Santos knelt in her mother's garden, her hands working mechanically among the roses that had somehow bloomed more brilliantly than ever before. Each flower seemed touched with an otherworldly radiance, as if Miguel's presence had blessed the very soil where his journey began. She didn't look up when the screen door creaked open behind her. "Mija," her mother said softly, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone who had aged years in mere days. "You need to eat something." Carmen's hand stilled among the petals. "He's still here, Mama. I can feel him in the roses, in the morning light. He's not gone. He's just different." Abuela Rosa reached out and touched her daughter's face, wiping away tears that had flowed almost constantly since Miguel's transformation. "See, Mijo is still with us, but not in the way we can hold him, feed him, watch him grow old." Inside the house, Roberto Santos sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by federal agents, reporters, and grief counselors, his voice steady as he recounted the impossible journey that had led to his son's sacrifice. But his eyes remained fixed on the garden window, where he swore he could sometimes see a small figure moving among the roses in the early morning light. The story had exploded across national news. The deaf boy who spoke with angels, who died to give voice to murdered children, who brought down a decades-old conspiracy through supernatural intervention. But for the Santos family, the headlines and interviews felt like descriptions of someone else's life. Their Miguel had been transformed into legend, and they were still learning how to love a legend instead of a son. Mrs. Delgado arrived as she had every morning since that night at the mine, carrying fresh bread and the quiet presence of someone who had shared the impossible. She found Carmen still kneeling among the roses, her rosary beads moving slowly through weathered fingers. "Any word from the investigation?" Carmen asked without looking up. "Whitfield's lawyers are trying to claim insanity," Mrs. Delgado said, settling onto the garden bench. "But with 4 federal agencies involved and evidence that keeps appearing wherever they look, It's not going well for him. The evidence was indeed appearing. Documents materializing in locked file cabinets, buried chemical containers surfacing during routine construction, witness testimonies emerging from people who had suddenly remembered long-suppressed encounters. Miguel and Elena's influence reached far beyond the spirit world, touching the physical realm in ways that made conventional investigation almost unnecessary. "The other families," Carmen said quietly. "The Sandovals, the Chens, the Rodriguezes. How are they?" Mrs. Delgado's expression softened. "Different than us, but the same too. Maria's mother says she dreams about her daughter every night now. Not nightmares, but conversations. Real talks about everything Maria missed, everything she would have become. Tommy's father has started a foundation for missing children. And Elena's family..." She paused, watching as a white butterfly alighted on the roses. Unusual for this season, unusual for this desert climate, but somehow perfectly right. "Elena's family wants to meet with you. They say Miguel and Elena appear to them together sometimes. Still cousins, still family, even in whatever they are now." Carmen finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I've been afraid to see them, afraid they'd blame us for not stopping him." "Mija," Abuela Rosa said firmly, "no one could have stopped what was meant to happen. Miguel chose his path the moment he first spoke Elena's name. We were just witnesses to grace." Inside the house, Roberto's voice carried through the open window as he finished yet another interview. "People ask me if I regret the miracle that gave my son speech. But Miguel wasn't given words just to speak. He was given them to complete something that began long before he was born. Our family was chosen to nurture a voice that would speak for the voiceless." As if summoned by his father's words, Miguel's presence suddenly filled the garden, not visible in any conventional sense, but unmistakably there. In the sudden warmth of the morning air, in the way the roses seemed to glow, in the absolute certainty that filled each woman's heart. "Mama." The word didn't come through ears but directly into Carmen's soul, carrying all the love a 12-year-old boy could pour into a single syllable. "I'm home. Different, but home." Carmen pressed her face into the roses and wept, not from grief anymore, but from the overwhelming joy of understanding that death had not taken her son away. It had simply transformed into something that could never be lost, never be silenced, never be forgotten. The butterflies multiplied, dozens of them now, dancing among the miraculous roses as Tucson awakened to another day in a world where the impossible had become eternal. The new beginning. 6 months had passed since Miguel Santos became legend, and the garden where miracles began had become a pilgrimage site. Carmen no longer fought the steady stream of visitors who came seeking their own impossible answers among roses that bloomed year-round in defiance of desert seasons. Instead, she had learned to tend both flowers and pilgrims with equal grace, understanding that her son's transformation had made their home a bridge between worlds. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the distant mountains in shades of gold, Carmen found herself preparing for visitors of a different kind. Elena's family was coming, not as strangers seeking miracles, but as relatives learning to navigate a new definition of family that transcended death itself. Roberto emerged from the house carrying folding chairs, his movements more deliberate than they had been 6 months ago. The federal investigation had concluded with Whitfield's conviction on multiple charges, but the weight of witnessing the supernatural had settled permanently in his shoulders. He moved like a man who had seen behind the curtain of reality and found the view both terrible and wonderful. "The Rodriguezes should be here soon," he said, arranging chairs beneath the mesquite tree where shade danced with morning light. Elena's grandmother specifically asked to sit where Miguel first spoke. Carmen nodded, her fingers automatically moving to the small silver medal she now wore, a gift from Elena's family, blessed by their parish priest and inscribed with the names of both children. It had become her anchor, a tangible reminder that love persists beyond the boundaries of life and death. Abuela Rosa shuffled outside carrying a tray of coffee and pastries, her movements slow but purposeful. At 83, she had become the unofficial keeper of Miguel's story, the one who could speak to reporters and pilgrims alike about the boy who had been chosen for an impossible task. But in private moments like these, she was simply a grandmother, learning to love a spirit instead of flesh. "They're here," Mrs. Delgado announced, appearing at the garden gate with Elena's family in tow. The group moved with the careful reverence of people entering sacred space. Elena's parents, Maria and Joaquin Rodriguez, her grandmother, Isabella, and her younger brother, Carlos, now 15 and carrying the weight of being the survivor. The reunion was awkward at first, two families bound by supernatural tragedy and miraculous resolution, trying to find common ground in the impossible. But as they settled into chairs arranged in a circle among Miguel's roses, something shifted in the desert air. The temperature warmed despite the autumn morning, and white butterflies began appearing among the flowers, dozens of them, their wings catching sunlight like scattered prayers. "They're here," Isabella whispered, her weathered hands pressed to her heart. Both of them. Carmen felt it too, that familiar presence that had become as natural as breathing over the past 6 months. Miguel's essence seemed to pulse through the garden itself, no longer the frightened boy who had first encountered Elena among these same roses, but something vast and peaceful and eternal. And beside him, equally strong, Elena's spirit danced through the morning light like music made visible. "I dream about them every night," Carlos said suddenly, his teenage voice cracking with emotion. "Elena and your Miguel, they're together. Still kids, but also something more. They protect other children now, lost ones, forgotten ones." Roberto leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "Miguel comes to us in dreams too. He shows us things, other families finding peace, other mysteries being solved. It's like his voice has become part of something bigger than just our story." As if responding to his words, a single white rose bloomed visibly before their eyes, its petals unfurling in fast-forward motion until it reached full glory in mere seconds. The impossible flower released a fragrance that carried memories. Elena's laughter, Miguel's first spoken words, the sound of children playing in gardens that existed somewhere between earth and eternity. "The foundation is working," Joaquin said, his voice thick with pride and sorrow. "The Carlos and Elena Rodriguez Foundation for Missing Children. We've helped find 12 kids in 6 months. Every time the investigators say they receive guidance, dreams, hunches, evidence that appears when they need it most." Carmen reached across the circle and took his hand. "Our children are still saving children. Different now," Maria Rodriguez added, tears streaming down her face. "But still ours, still family." The presence in the garden intensified, and suddenly every person in the circle could feel 2 small hands touching their shoulders, one pair familiar from blood and memory, the other known through spirit and sacrifice. Miguel's voice reached them not through ears but through hearts, carrying Elena's laughter along with his words. "We are the bridge," they heard him say, his communication encompassing both families in its embrace. Between the lost and the found, between silence and voice, between ending and beginning. This is what love becomes when it chooses sacrifice. The butterflies swirled upward in perfect spirals, carrying prayers toward a sky that no longer seemed empty of miracles. In the garden, where a deaf boy had first heard an angel speak, 2 families had learned to love beyond death itself, and discovered that some endings are actually doorways to stories that will never end.